Debbie, I think we are live.
Oh, we are live. Hello and welcome. I'm so sorry to know we were live. This is Debbie Georgatos. Hello and welcome to Park Cites Republican Women and to our very first effort at a streamed meeting during this coronavirus shutdown. I'm so glad that Lane Sullivan, the president of Park Cites Republican Women, and Nancy Mello, the VP of Programs, organized this great idea to have a meeting online. We have joining us Hans von Spakovsky, whom I'll introduce more in a moment. I just want to take a minute to say what a great day in America it is for liberty. What a great day. And the same day, we have Lieutenant General Michael Flynn finding out today that the Department of Justice is dropping the charges against him, dropping the case after all we've talked about in this club and through our political activity to have this man finally get justice and charges dropped. Great day for America. Of course, he's represented by Sidney Powell, a great friend of our club, Park Cites Republican Women, and she's done a stellar job bringing out the truth of how he was mistreated by the Department of Justice. Other great news for liberty in Texas today. We had, as sure many of you have heard, the salon owner who was actually sent to jail for opening her salon during this coronavirus shutdown was freed from jail today. So she really just served 2 days instead of 7, freed by order of the Texas Supreme Court, which is another great victory for liberty and for people speaking up. So just a great, great day for liberty. Well, we're going to go forward tonight and interview Hans von Spakovsky on the topic of the reliability and questions surrounding mail-in ballots. And I'll tell all of our listeners, in case you were not aware of that in Dallas County, the Dallas County Commissioner's Court actually voted recently 4-1 to try to push for all mail-in ballots in our November elections. And so this is a real issue in Texas, in Dallas County, about whether or not mail-in ballots, whether it's legitimate to turn to that in this time of coronavirus. I also want to tell you very quickly how we're going to do this event tonight. I will be asking Hans questions. He'll share his expertise with you. And then when we're finished, that's half an hour at the most, there's all of you, I believe, can see a chat box on the right. You can type in your questions there. You can type them in on Facebook, and we will then have questions from the audience as they are typed in. And I really want to thank everyone who's helping me logistically get this rolling. I believe we have it rolling. So allow me to introduce Hans von Spakovsky. Many of you heard his name before. He's a very prominent national spokesperson on the topic of mail-in ballots. He is the manager of election law reform of the Election Law Reform Initiative and the senior legal fellow at the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. He is a prolific writer and speaker. He has great articles up explaining the details of why mail-in ballots and other forms of potential voter fraud are so troublesome and not necessary. He also is he studies and writes on campaign finance restrictions, voter fraud, voter ID, and he is a co-author with John Fund of the book, Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. It's kind of a scary title. So without further ado, hello, Hans, welcome.
Debbie, thank you for having me. I was supposed to be down speaking to the Dallas Club a month ago in person, and unfortunately, as you know, that got canceled because of the COVID-19 virus and the general shutdown of the country. So I'm glad to at least be able to do it tonight.
Well, I'm so grateful. Thank you. I'm grateful for Lane Sullivan, our president, and Nancy Mello, our VP of Programs, for pushing this idea along and giving us all the idea we could actually do this online. So let's just start with this. There's great discussion in this country because of the coronavirus and the supposed continued concern about in-person voting that maybe it's safer and better for America to turn to mail-in ballots in the fall elections in November 2020. And so I just want to ask you, conservatives usually say, we don't like mail-in ballots. They have a potential for fraud. But the first question is that fair and accurate? Are mail-in ballots subject to fraud more so than in-person voting?
Yes, and the reason for that is very simple if you think about it. These are ballots that are received, voted, and submitted outside of the supervision and watch of election officials. And if you look at the cases that have come up with regard to absentee ballots, there are many of them. And in fact, we have a database at the Heritage Foundation that we started just a couple of years ago. It's not a comprehensive list. It is a sampling of proven voter fraud cases from across the country. We literally, within the last day or so, just added another half dozen cases. We're up to almost 1,300 proven cases, and many of them involve absentee ballot fraud. The other problem, of course, with it is that it destroys the secret ballot, and second, it makes it easier for voters to be intimidated and pressured. And you see that often in these cases. I mean, anybody who doubts that, just take a look at what happened in the North Carolina 9 congressional race in 2018. It was the only contested race in the country. It was overturned. Why? Well, because a political consultant hired by one of the candidates, he and his staff were going to voters' homes and, in essence, taking their absentee ballots, filling them out, forging signatures, and because of that, the election was overturned. There are numerous other cases like that. And listen, that happens in Texas too. Our database has dozens of voter fraud cases from Texas, and there are quite a few of them that involve absentee ballots.
So I just want to talk a little bit about how it happens. So assuming you have perfectly accurate voter records and you really have a correct name of a voter and their address, and you mail the ballot out to them. So in the perfect world, if I were registered to vote, which I am, and I received it and I put it back in the mail and sent it back in, there's not really a problem with just mailing. Is that right? It's really more when people are interfering with that process in some way, the kind of cases you described? Or is there even a problem with just the fact that mail-in ballots can be lost in the mail?
No, there is a problem with them being lost in the mail. Look, anybody watching us tonight, I'm sure, has received mail at their house. I just received from this week that was actually intended for someone with the same number but a different street in my town. And anyone who doubts this doesn't happen with absentee or all mail ballots, all you have to do is look at the reports that are filed by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. This is a federal agency, and every 2 years after federal elections, they file an official report with Congress. That report is filled with data they get from all of the states. And to show you how big of a problem this is, when it comes to absentee ballots, they list absentee ballots that were misdirected. In other words, a voter requested a ballot, but when the Postal Service tried to deliver it there, it turned out that person didn't live there. They list unknown absentee ballots. That means that the state officials turned it over to the Postal Service to deliver to voters, and they never heard another word about it. You know, maybe the voter got it and decided not to vote it. We don't know. Plus, they list rejected ballots that came back and didn't comply and weren't counted. How big of a problem is this? In the 2016 election, remember, Hillary Clinton had 2.9 million more votes than Donald Trump in the national popular vote. According to EAC, 6.5 million absentee or mail-in ballots were misdirected, rejected, or they don't know what happened to them.
So let me just summarize that. More ballots were lost in the mail than the difference between the margin of victory Hillary had over Donald Trump. Is that what you just said?
Well, lost as in election officials don't know what happened to it after they put it in the mail, were misdirected. The Postal Service sent it back saying nobody lives there, or they were rejected because when they did come back, they didn't comply with the rules for absentee ballots. And of course, remember, if you're in a polling place, the election official can try to correct a mistake. When you're voting on your own, that isn't going to happen.
Well, you're speaking, Hans, to the Park Cities Republican Women, which is a club filled with women who serve as election judges, precinct chairs, election clerks, volunteers. All of us have done this, and all of us have helped people who didn't understand what they're supposed to do with the form, understood they had messed up their ballot. It's so true that when you vote in person, people can help you and really, fix an otherwise defective ballot that won't be counted. So this is interesting, though, because we have this discussion. And aren't there a couple states where they've used or at least one state, all mail-in ballots for years?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are now 5 states doing that. And the first one that started doing it was Oregon. And what they do in Oregon is they mail an absentee ballot to every single registered voter. Of course, the problem with that is that voter rolls all over the country, including in Oregon, are in terrible shape.
Yeah.
You know, they are not kept current. They're not kept accurate. They have the names on them of lots of people who no longer live at those addresses, who've died, and otherwise become ineligible. And if I could tell a quick story about that, too, actually. Some years ago, a professor at one of the state universities did a survey in Oregon of just one county. According to her survey, 5% of the people she contacted admitted that someone else had filled out their ballot. 2.5% admitted that somebody else had signed their ballot. Now, that may not sound like a lot of votes, but if you carried that number out to the rest of the state, that meant tens of thousands of ballots were basically fraudulently submitted. And the final story on that I just have to tell you is some years ago when I was still working at the Justice Department, I was actually in Oregon for a national meeting of election officials. The head of elections in Oregon was up at the front of the room talking about how wonderful their system was and how secure it was. And one of the election officials from another state leaned over to me and said, "Well, my sister-in-law lives in Oregon, and in the last election, she voted 3 times." And I said, "Well, how did she do that?" She said, "Well, she voted her ballot that she had gotten in the mail. She filled out and signed her husband's ballot that she had gotten in the mail. And she voted a third ballot that she had gotten in the mail that came in under her maiden name because she was registered twice." And that, of course, is a problem in any state where the people are registered more than once, and that happens all the time. If a state is mailing out absentee ballots, you're going to get more than one ballot, and the chances of the state catching that, if you vote more than once, are very slim.
Very slim. People use the expression ballot harvesting. That's been a source of ballot fraud. Can you describe what that term means?
Sure, and Texas has had a real problem with that, and there have been prosecutions in Texas, particularly along the southern counties along the southern border. Look, in every state, you can vote by absentee ballot. And in every state, you can either return it in person yourself, you can mail it back, members of your family can return it for you. But in a number of states, such as California, they've opened it up so that anyone can show up at your home to pick up your ballot. What does that mean? Well, it means that people who have a stake in the outcome of the election, candidates, campaign organizations, party activists, political guns for hire, they are the people coming to your house to pick up your ballots. And those are the kind of people who, in the cases that we see, are the ones who change ballots, who sometimes pressure the voter to vote a particular way, and to pull the kind of shenanigans that unfortunately are dangerous. It just doesn't make any sense. And there's no need to allow any third party to pick up your ballot when it's so easy to mail it back or have yourself or a member of your family return it.
And there were elections in California which seem to have been turned from a Republican to a Democrat victory. I mean, it could be either way, but in the more recent elections, I think it was 2018, where it seemed on election night you had the victory or re-election of a Republican for Congress, and then when all these mail-in ballots finally got counted, lo and behold, what is it, 5 or 6 of them switched to the Democrat victor? Is that, do you remember, are you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, something like 250,000 ballots came in after election day. And for anyone who doubts the problem with that, there's actually a video out on the internet. You can find it taken through one of those doorbell videos of a woman who comes to the door of someone's house who says, "I'm here to pick up your ballot and deliver it, but I'm only picking up and delivering Democratic ballots."
Oh my gosh, audacious.
And it is, but what you have to understand is, look, it would be very easy for a vote harvester. They have a lot of information about voters. You know, they can tell probably which candidate you're going to vote for, depending on the primaries you voted for and a lot of other information. And it would not be very difficult for a vote harvester for one political party, for example, to go into a neighborhood that he knows people vote for the other political party and say, you know, I'm happy to pick up your ballot, and then throw them all away and not deliver them, because how's the voter ever going to know that their vote didn't get delivered?
That was the next thing I was going to say, is how does anyone ever know if unless you physically deliver your ballot to the election office, how do you ever know it gets there? Or especially with other people picking them up, it seems like the voters shouldn't want mail-in ballots. People who want their vote to count should not want to go down this path, right?
No, they shouldn't, because look, it's a lot of trouble. Yeah, a voter can check with election officials to see if they show that they got an absentee ballot for them, but the vast majority of voters aren't going to do that. And to illustrate that again, look, one of the cases we have in our database is 4 individuals, including 2 political consultants, who were convicted of absentee ballot fraud in Troy, New York, just a few years ago. They targeted a low-income housing neighborhood, stole absentee ballots, filled them out, fraudulently submitted them for actual and real registered voters. The political consultant, when he was interviewed by the police, he was asked, why did you target this particular neighborhood? And his answer was, well, these are individuals who are least likely to notice that their ballot has been stolen, and least likely to complain about it.
So taking advantage of people who are especially not particularly equipped, maybe educated, or not particularly engaged in life, and so they're easier to take advantage of. The most vulnerable, sounds like.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so here we are in 2020 dealing with a coronavirus concern, right, and people talking about, well, you know, I don't think we should be concerned at all, to make my position clear, about voting in the fall in person, because you can still go to the grocery store and many other places where we're near each other. There's no reason you can't. If we still think we have to be practicing mask wearing and social distancing in November, no reason you can't do that at the ballot box. But that's my little soapbox. And you can actually, do you see a reason why we have to turn away from in-person voting this fall?
No, and I'll tell you why. And anybody who's interested in this, I actually published a Heritage Foundation paper last week just on this topic. Look, other countries have held elections, including in-person voting, in the middle of these kind of health situations. Probably the best example of this is Liberia held a very important national election in 2014 in the midst of the Ebola epidemic hitting West Africa. Okay. It is a much more dangerous disease. Yeah. What they did is they set out very specific safety protocols for voters coming in to polling places, and they followed them strictly, and they had a successful election. At the beginning of April, remember April 7th, which is not very long ago, Wisconsin held its primary election in the middle of this COVID crisis. They included in-person voting. At least 300,000 individuals voted in person in Wisconsin. Wisconsin set out a long list of safety protocols, everything from the poll workers and others wearing masks and gloves and all that, to express rules for the cleaning and sanitizing of election materials, voting booths before and after people went in. There was just a paper published about that election, and the title of it is, in essence, that there's been no surge in COVID-19 infections as a result of that election. So they were able to successfully and safely carry out that election, as you said, taking even more precautions than the precautions being taken in the grocery stores and drugstores that we are all going to.
Absolutely. I want to also turn about this fall's elections, November 2020. There's some talk, well, if everyone's so concerned about mail-in ballots for all the reasons that you just described, what about if we try to get an online voting system in place? And so everyone can I'm not advocating for this, but this is being discussed. I want to hear what you think about it. What are the shortfalls of online voting? Is that also a big problem?
Extremely dangerous. And look, that's not just my opinion. That's the opinion of some of the leading science, computer scientists in the world, people out of Silicon Valley. Every group that has looked at this, including the National Science Foundation, the National Bureau of Standards, the Commerce Department, All of them that have looked at this have said that it is too dangerous. There's no way to have a secure election with online voting because there are too many security problems inherent in the hardware and software that all of us use, particularly with our home computers, and in the way the internet itself is designed. We have fraud all the time over the internet. I think people know that, and elections pose even more special problems. It is such a dangerous situation that there's really been no successful internet voting project of any kind set up in the United States. And the closest we've come to it is several years ago, the District of Columbia wanted to set up an online voting system, particularly for residents of the district who were overseas. They hired a contractor. The contractor came in, built a system, said, oh, this system is great. Nobody will be able to hack it. And DC was so proud of their system that they did a test election and they challenged any hackers in the world to try to break into their system for this fake election. A computer science professor, I think at the University of Michigan, assigned this as a project to his graduate students. And within 48 hours, they had successfully hacked into the system, and the District of Columbia was unable to detect that they had hacked into it. In fact, the only way they finally found out about it was that folks who have voted, on electronic voting machines know that after you cast your ballot, a big screen comes up saying, "Thank you for voting." Well, they changed it so that when you got to the end of the pilot project and had voted and it said, "Thank you for voting," it started playing the University of Michigan fight song. And that's the only way they figured out that it had been hacked into.
Okay, that is priceless. What a great, great story. So are not going to do well. Clearly, if we want to have election integrity, we're not going to do well with mail-in ballots or online voting. So do you at Heritage Foundation, are you talking with or putting out any suggestions for how in the fall we should go forward with our November 2020 elections in a way that is safe and effective and includes integrity?
Yeah, I mean, last week, again, we put out a fact sheet on how if we do have to have a lot of absentee balloting because of the health crisis, there are ways to do it and there are ways not to do it. And we kind of lay all of that out, in what we have put together. I think the most important thing for people to understand is that the worst thing that could be done is for Congress to pass a bill about this. That was attempted by Nancy Pelosi with the coronavirus bill she put in. There's a current bill in the Senate sponsored by Senator Wyden and Klobuchar. And what those bills do is lay all these federal mandates onto the states when it comes to the handling of absentee and mail-in ballots. And there's no reason for that. Every state already has its own rules and regulations governing the handling of absentee ballots. There's no reason for the feds to get into this, well, except for one. If you look at all of these provisions that have been put into Pelosi's bill and Senator Klobuchar and Wyden's bill, what they in essence do is get rid of all of the safety and security protocols that the states have. I mean, to give you an example, their bills would require every state to allow vote harvesting.
Yeah.
So the states that have outlawed it, like North Carolina, would now have to allow vote harvesting. I mean, that's one of the worst provisions in the bill, but there are numerous other provisions like that basically get rid of, like I said, the safety protocols states have put in place for the handling of mail-in ballots.
I don't know if it's this particular bill you're speaking of, but early on when the Congress was looking at coronavirus relief, the many things that were included, and they were Nancy Pelosi's suggestion. I was calling them in my show the Vote Fraud Enablement Act. I mean, they were just, I think I said that when you were on my show too. It's like Vote Fraud Enablement was, I think it required permitting same-day registration.
Every state would have to allow that, yes.
Yeah, same-day registration, ballot harvesting. It also had disallowed any check on citizenship. Or there was some provision in there where they're just trying to.
Well, it got rid of all voter ID requirements.
What could go wrong? What
No,
could go wrong?
exactly. And by the way, I have to compliment Texas on the fact that it has a voter ID law. And it was more than a decade ago that I actually flew down to Austin and testified in front of the Texas State Senate in favor of what at that time the legislature was considering, which was their voter ID bill.
Yep, Texas is trying to do it right. Well, I want to say we're getting close to time where you said people could put questions in. And I'm sorry I was looking away while you were speaking. This is my effort to hold on to, I'm trying to read the comments and questions on my iPad while we're speaking. And somehow my iPad is fighting with me on this. So I may ask Pia, who is paying attention here. I think she's going to text me some questions. I think if you have questions, if you're listening to this interview, he's the man to ask. If you have any questions about vote fraud and what we should do as a country in the fall elections, anything like that, please do feel free to put your questions into the screen. And I think Pia will have to text them to me here because I'm somehow not making them come up on my screen. But I actually, one more question for you before we do that. I want to make sure Pia is alert to the fact I can't see the questions yet. But, you know, in America, it seems like I know that Heritage Foundation is a nonpartisan organization, and that's wonderful, and 501c3 and C4 and all that. And you are speaking to Republican women who are just very dedicated to fair elections. So as we get close to the November 2020 elections, do you see things happening? Are you concerned about the fact that this effort of putting in things in coronavirus legislation or urging mail-in ballots, do you perceive that as I don't want to make it partisan, but are you concerned that there is a potential that people are trying to use the coronavirus crisis as a means to put in things into law, into practice that wouldn't otherwise pass muster in Congress?
100% correct. That's exactly what is happening. And a quick example of that is, look, we're all supposed to be social distancing, right, because of the coronavirus. Well, if that's the case, why is it that Nancy Pelosi's bill put in a requirement that every state has to have 2 weeks of early voting? Now, if a state itself wants to make that decision, it can. Texas has early voting, but there are other states that don't. They think people should be able to vote on election day. They don't like the idea of early voting. But the point is, why would you put that into a federal statute and require states that don't want that to have to put that kind of a provision in? So that clearly has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the coronavirus. Neither does requiring every state to allow same-day registration, which means that on election day, even if you're not registered to vote, you can register to vote and then immediately vote.
Oh, I meant to mention that one day of registration.
Yeah.
I mean, that is like, as I say, voter fraud enablement.
It is, because election officials then obviously have no time whatsoever to verify any of the information you've given as to your identity, where you live, or your citizenship. And for anybody who thinks, oh, that shouldn't be an issue, listen, one of the cases that we've just added to our voter registration voter fraud database is a city councilman in Ohio who's just been removed from office. Why? He registered at his parents' address, which is in the town where he got elected to the city council, despite the fact that he doesn't actually live there. He actually lives in another town outside of there. That's voter registration fraud, but it shows that being able to verify, for example, voter registration information is very important.
One other thing, Hans, just as a general, I meant to ask you this at the start, as a general proposition of law, you're an expert in election law, constitutional law. Is it accurate that there's some constitutional premise that says states essentially do have the right to establish their own laws and standards related to election integrity? Is that a constitutionally driven idea?
Yeah, look, the Constitution divides up responsibility between the federal government and the state governments when it comes to elections. But the states basically are given a huge amount of leeway when it comes to elections. Particularly, they are 100% given the power to determine the eligibility of voters. That's why, if folks recall, remember, we passed an amendment during the Vietnam War to change the voting age nationally from 21 down to 18. The reason we had to have a constitutional amendment was that has to do with eligibility. Congress couldn't just pass a law saying the voting age now will be 18 all over the country, because that was a power that only the states had. We had to have a constitutional amendment to establish that, and that shows you how states have a huge amount of power. Plus, keep in mind, we have the most decentralized election system of any Western democracy. The feds do not administer our elections. That's done down at the state level, and the states run not only their own state elections, but they run federal elections too, congressional and presidential elections.
It is an amazing thing. And actually, for anyone concerned about corruption in Washington, or the idea that you keep control of election integrity and counting and eligibility within the states, it is one way in which it seems like you reduce the likelihood of fraud. Or to put the other way, if it's all controlled out of Washington, people can be far more concerned that fraud or bad actors can get in the middle of it and change results. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. Yeah. The founders clearly thought that giving Congress that power would be a bad idea, because it would mean the federal government could potentially change the rules to make it easier to manipulate results so that folks who are in control politically in Washington could stay in power.
Yep. Okay, so we have some questions here. I'm just reading from my phone. And so the first one was, they're talking about the Dallas County Commissioners Court, which is the highest legislative body in the county of Dallas. The county judge is not a judge. He's the highest executive official. But they recently voted 4-1. They want to move forward with mail-in ballots. So in Dallas, and that is not yet settled. That's going to happen. I think our Texas State Attorney General is looking at that. But first question, what do you think to make up for the concerns that people have about, if they do have concerns, but in-person voting, what about the idea of saying do early voting, 6 to 8 weeks prior to election day? And so you have early voting in many we do early voting here for 2 weeks usually. Right. So what if you do early voting for 6 to 8 weeks ahead of time to allow people to be more spread out, less concerned about coming into contact and endangering the social distancing standards? What do you think about that idea?
Well, the question I would have is, how crowded are the early voting sites? Okay, and the reason I mention that is an incident that occurred during the Obama presidency. Folks may recall that during one of his State of the Union addresses, he pointed out to a guest that he had up in the gallery was a elderly African-American woman who lived in Miami. And he was saying people should not have to wait for hours in line. And this lady had to wait all this time in line. I think it was several hours to be able to vote. Well, what he didn't mention was that she didn't vote on election day when there are hundreds of polling places open in Miami. Yeah. She tried to vote on the first day of early voting when Miami only had, I think it was, I can't remember exactly, it was only like 10 or 20 early voting sites open. Everybody else was trying to go vote early also, and that's why she had to wait in such a long line. If she had gone to vote on election day, apparently the waiting time was much, much shorter because so many more polling places were open. So the question I would have is, how crowded would all the early voting sites be, and would that actually be worse than having the many more polling places open on election day?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know. And actually in Texas, we've been changing, in Dallas County, we've been changing the number of places we have to vote and changing rules about that. So I guess experts could look into that and try to make a prediction about which ones are most crowded. And I don't know, that's one thought, 6 to 8 weeks. I'm actually, as a personal thought, I would love to have all voting happen on election day in person, unless you are in the military or you're bedridden and can't get out, and that we have special voting capacity for people who can't get out. But pretty much, I just think the early voting I don't know. Actually, what's your thought about that? Do you think that everyone voting on election day is a better plan, or is that not feasible?
It is, and I actually published a heritage paper on early voting. There's two things people should keep in mind with early voting that are drawbacks of early voting. First of all, this is kind of counterintuitive, but there have been a number of studies done looking at states with early voting and comparing them to states that don't have early voting, and they actually have concluded, social scientists have, that early voting actually hurts turnout.
Wow.
It hurts turnout. It does not increase turnout. And the reason they believe it may be is because it spreads out the voting process over so many weeks that you lose a small percentage of people who keep saying, well, I can vote, I'll do it. They keep putting it off and then they don't vote.
I still have time. I still have time. Yeah.
Exactly right. And the second problem with it, and this is really true in primaries, early voting can basically cause a voter to totally waste their vote. And the example I would give you of that is, remember on Super Tuesday, we had what, more than a dozen states holding primaries across the country, including, I believe, in Texas. And what happened? The 2 days, I think 2 days before the election and 1 day before the election, Senator Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg dropped out of the election. Well, if you look at the vote totals for those two candidates, you'll find that literally hundreds of thousands of Democratic voters had voted for those two candidates during the early voting process. And by the time election day rolled around, those candidates were gone. So that meant they had wasted their vote and they couldn't pull it back.
Very good point. Very good point. Another question we have coming in is, we have some people in Dallas County are saying, well, if we have this whole mail-in ballot thing, do you have any suggestions or practices if we're stuck with mail-in ballot to control that you can suggest or recommend to ensure that mail-in votes are legitimate votes?
Well, I'll give you one example of this. If you absolutely have to do this because the health crisis is so bad, you just can't have open polls. Here's what you should not do. You should not mail an absentee ballot to every registered voter, because that means ballots will be showing up at the homes of people who don't live there anymore or have died, and somebody might be tempted to vote those ballots, and or vote harvesters may come through the neighborhood collecting those ballots so they can vote them. If you want to do this kind of election, then you should mail an absentee ballot request form to each voter. That voter then will have to fill that out, sign it, send it back. That gives election officials, one, the opportunity to try to authenticate the absentee ballot request, but it also, if you send that by first-class mail, the post office will return that absentee ballot request form in the envelope if they determine that that registered voter doesn't live at that address anymore. And that gives election officials important information that, hey, this person is registered to vote. You need to investigate. They may not live in your county anymore, and they shouldn't be on the registered voter list.
That is a great idea. Just make the person actually request. And I'm always, and the voter, I know many people are bothered by vote fraud. I'm really bothered by election fraud and vote fraud. And I've always thought every single form you fill out, you should have to sign under penalty of perjury. I mean, even the request for a vote, for a ballot. And so if you end up requesting a ballot knowing, I don't really live here, I'm visiting from Missouri, but hey, while I'm here, I might as well. You'd love to have penalty of perjury. Number one, it might encourage or discourage some people from filling the form out. And number two is you have somebody to go after them if they really, do you like that idea? I'm into, let's get these people if they're going to cheat. But.
Oh, yeah. Look, one of the biggest problems we have is local prosecutors not prosecuting cases. And I've seen that so many times. The database we have, which, as I said, has about 1,300 cases now, it would have many, many more cases if prosecutors were willing to prosecute the case. I know of thousands of individual cases of non-citizens who registered and voted in my state of Virginia, and prosecutors have failed to do anything about that.
I completely believe that. And I also, you hear the argument, at least from some prosecutors or defenders of mail-in voting. Well, you never know. They just got confused. As an older person, you can't prosecute this. And it's like, no, I'm not after the older person who's confused. I'm after the person who actually filled the ballot out. But another question. So they talk a lot. People were talking, how are we supposed to help swing the millennial and Gen Z vote who are more open to mail-in ballots or technology-driven? They seem to think everything's. Do you have any arguments to make to the Gen Z and millennial votes who would, we assume, support this kind of stuff?
Well, all I can say is that they just have to be educated about it, and that is one of the things I try to do at the Heritage Foundation by writing a lot about this. I think, off the top of their heads, a lot of this stuff just sounds great. But when you actually start explaining to them the problems with it, then they suddenly start realizing, oh, well, maybe this is not such a good idea. Let me give you another example of this. There are folks now who are pushing for more mail-in ballots who are also saying, oh, election officials also need to pre-stamp the envelopes that they're sending to the voters, so the voter doesn't have to put a stamp on the envelope when he sends back the absentee ballot. Now, that may sound like, oh yeah, that's going to make it more convenient for voters. Maybe it's a good idea. But here's the problem with that. In a lot of states, when you mail back your absentee ballot, it has to be postmarked by Election Day to ensure that you are not waiting till after Election Day to see the preliminary results before you vote, because that would be cheating, right? Well, if election officials are pre-stamping, putting their postmarks on the envelopes that they then mail to the voter, there'll be no way for them, when the voter sends it back, to know whether the voter actually mailed their ballot by the end of Election Day or whether they waited until after Election Day to do it. So while that sounds like an innocuous, good government thing, it actually would increase the security problems with absentee ballots.
I'm telling you, Hans, I'm realizing I don't have a devious enough mind. I would never think of these things. I got to work on that. Next one was, in Dallas County, we have the same company, ES&S, not only providing the voting equipment and related software, they're also used to oversee the final tally of the votes after the election is finished, after early voting and day of elections. Do you see a problem with the same company performing all aspects of our voting process?
Well, I guess what I would say about that is that, look, most of the equipment that's used around the country, including that used by ES&S, is certified and tested not only in these national labs that look at that kind of equipment, but also by many states that have requirements for that. And in every state, including in Texas, they have poll watcher laws that allow the candidates and the parties to not only observe voting going on in polling places, but also to observe the tabulation, processing, and counting of ballots once they get to the county headquarters. So no, I'm not worried about ES&S doing that, but I would urge folks to make sure that there are observers in their county at every level of the voting process to ensure that the laws are being properly followed and nothing untoward is going on.
Okay. We also, a question here, it seems that we should have the technological ability to prove that our vote was properly counted. And I'm not sure in what avenue of voting this is directed, but the whole idea, when you're in person, you vote and you watch it go in the machine, it pops up, not with the Michigan fight song or whatever it was, but with the actual, right. Yeah, you voted. But when you have other forms of voting, mail-in ballot or online, aren't you a little less likely to know as the voter whether it was counted?
Well, yeah, unless you go to the trouble after the election of calling election officials and asking, did you get my ballot? Was it voted? And the vast majority of voters just, aren't going to do that.
Oh, yeah. Okay. And then also in the whole process of voting, one question is there a penalty for perjury for lying on a voter form. Say you fill out request your absentee ballot and you actually don't live in this state, but you figure what the heck, I might as well get one. Is it a penalty for perjury type thing for even filling it out?
Yeah, there's a federal law. It's actually a provision of the National Voter Registration Act that makes it a federal crime for you to lie on a voter registration form. There are even other statutes. I mean, that's just in general for putting a false statement on a voter registration form. But there are other separate statutes. For example, if an alien claims citizenship, and remember, there is a citizenship question on voter registration forms that ask you, are you a yes citizen or not? If you're an alien and you answer yes, you're not only violating that federal voting rights provision, you're violating a whole separate provision of federal immigration law that applies to people falsely claiming citizenship.
And which is a criminal offense?
Yes, it is a criminal offense.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't, as I said, I'm not seeing the questions on here. I'm only seeing my phone. So since there is another one, I'm going to jump in with one. And Hans, I did not give you a heads up. I wanted to ask about this, but I know you have, but you know everything. Everyone knows you know everything. Right. But there was the topic, I think you've talked on my show with me about it, about the Electoral College and the effort of the left to change it to the NPV, the National Popular Vote Initiative. We're trying to say eliminate the Constitution, Electoral College, move to national popular vote. Where are we on that?
Yeah, this is to explain very quickly. There's an organization out in California called National Popular Vote Plan, Inc. And they have a lot of money, and they've been lobbying state legislatures to pass and become part of a state compact. The state compact is a contract between states. And what the compact says is, once enough states have passed this compact such that between them they have 270 electoral college votes, which is the amount you need to become president, each of these states then agrees that from now on in every presidential election, they will award their electoral college votes not to the presidential candidate who won a majority in their state. They will award the electoral college votes to whoever the national popular vote winner is. It's a terrible idea for many reasons, but where we are is they're about 3/4 of the way towards their goal. They've had 15 states plus the District of Columbia pass it. Almost, I think virtually all of them have been blue states, not red states. The only recent exception to that, which was actually a great exception, was, Nevada has both a democratically controlled legislature and a Democratic governor. The democratically controlled legislature actually passed this National Popular Vote Plan compact, and the Democratic governor vetoed the bill. And he said quite correctly that this would hurt the smaller, more rural, less populated parts of the country, and it would throw the presidential election to the big cities, the big urban areas. They would decide who's the president.
Exactly right. It's amazing that national popular vote, even the name sounds enticing. Like, well, gee, that sounds fair. And yet the Constitution calls for the Electoral College. So in this compact situation, if they were to get the number of states to sign on to create this compact, that still has to be approved by Congress. Is that right or not?
Well, I believe, yes, it does, because state compacts are supposed to be approved by Congress. The National Popular Vote Plan people claim that it does not need to be approved by Congress. So what would happen if this actually went into effect is you would see a heck of a big lawsuit that would end up before the U.S. Supreme Court. And I should mention, by the way, on this issue, there's actually next week before the U.S. Supreme Court, there's going to be arguments in 2 cases that have been consolidated about the issue of faithless electors.
Yeah.
These are presidential electors who pledged they would vote for a particular candidate, and then when it came to their actual vote in December of a presidential election year, broke their pledge and voted for someone else. And the whole idea, the case is all about, can states punish those faithless electors? Can they nullify their vote? This issue has never been decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. They're hearing oral arguments about it next week. One case out of Washington State a second case out of Colorado. So that's going to be a very interesting case to see how the court decides that.
That is a very interesting issue. Wow.
It
wow.
is.
Just amazing. Well, Hans von Spakovsky, it's always great to talk with you. You're a fount of knowledge. I will tell everyone listening, Park Cities Republican Women, I will, after we're done, I can post in the comment section on this page links to all the articles that Hans has written on this subject. I pulled them all up before we get started tonight. So definitely want you to read what he writes. Great guy to follow. So tell our listeners, if you would please, Hans, to find you on the Heritage Foundation website. You go to, how do you find you?
Just go to heritage.org, heritage.org, and if you plug in just Hans, Hans, you don't even have to spell my last name. You'll pull it up. I'm the only Hans at Heritage.
It's the virtue of a unique, and it's a great name. It's a unique name. So Hans von Spakovsky, thank you so very much for joining us. I appreciate that so much.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
And Park Cities Republican Women, I want to tell you before you go, we do have a meeting of all things in person. It'll be so great to see all of you people. We have a meeting coming up in person at the Museum of Biblical Art, where we normally meet. It's with our speaker will be SMU economics professor Bob Lawson. I've had him on my show also. He's really fun. He wrote the book, or is co-author of the book, Socialism Sucks: How Two Economics Professors Drank Their Way Through the Unfree World. And they actually did do that. They went traveling around and had beers and chit-chatted. So the meeting is in 2 weeks, is Tuesday, May 19th. Tuesday, May 19th at 6 p.m. in person. Everyone, we're looking forward to having you come. You can wear a mask if you would like to. You don't have to wear a mask if you don't. We'll be practicing social distancing. Do whatever you're comfortable with. We want you to be comfortable, but definitely want to have you come. And in addition to the speaker that night, as an added bonus, his book, Socialism Sucks, PCRW is giving a free copy of the book to all paid PCRW members. So if you haven't paid your dues, now's your time. You can do it online at the Park Cities Republican Women website. And you get a free copy of the book. I can't tell you, really easy read, fun read, great speaker. Also, you'll please watch your email. There'll be a formal email to everyone letting you know about the meeting. And also, of course, a notice on Facebook and on the website. We also want to say a very special thank you to Pia Lara. She is the PCRW Communications VP. To say that she has been a gem and extremely valuable in getting this whole thing set up doesn't begin to describe, because we had to figure out the logistics of getting an interview live streaming onto the Facebook page. And Pia was just a gem and hard worker, figured it out and made it, and actually answered all my questions, even when I asked the same question more than once. She was just wonderful. So thank you to her for technical assistance and social media expertise. Want to thank everyone for tuning in to this meeting of Park Cities Republican Women. It's just been a extraordinary time in American history and Texas history, and be going through the coronavirus period, the shutdown, the protests, and the people moving to open America, and the people wanting more shutdown. Just great issues to be thinking and talking about. And it's a really important time to recognize that this coronavirus episode, the shutdown, the effort to reopen, all of these will be in play and be part of the political conversation leading up to the fall elections, November 2020. So we all need to be informed. We all need to be on top of the issues and understanding that this is, what may have tremendous impact on the fall election. So we need all of our good Republicans on board, rock solid, energized, are ready to be part of the November 2020 elections. And I believe we are ready to wrap up. Yeah, we are ready to wrap up this meeting. Thank you so much for coming to Park Cities Republican Women and Unique Circumstances. But I hope you enjoyed hearing from Hans von Spakovsky. And when we finish, I'll post all of his articles and comment sections. You'll love reading them. Very easy reads, very comfortable reading. So thank you again to Lane Sullivan for organizing this whole effort, and to Nancy Mello, our VP of Programs, putting this all together. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back. Park Cities Republican Women will be back in 2 weeks in person at the SMU Museum of, SMU economics professor Bob Lawson is our speaker at the Museum of Biblical Art, May 19th, Tuesday, 6 p.m. I will see you then. Thank you for listening.